researcher at the International Council on Clean Transportation. I primarily study air pollution and air emissions generally from ships, from international ships, and my colleagues work on emissions from aviation and from passenger vehicles. The ICCT is an independent nonprofit research organization. We have offices in Washington, D.C., San Francisco, and also Berlin and now Beijing. We're most recently famous for accidentally uncovering the Volkswagen Dieselgate scandal through our research, and that with West Virginia University. So my colleagues work on passenger vehicles and I work on ships. And today I'll be focusing on explaining some of the trends in air pollution and greenhouse gas emissions from the international shipping sector, explaining a little bit more about what the International Maritime Organization, which Alice was talking about, has recently done in order to try and reduce emissions from the sector. And then now that we have this ambition, how exactly are we going to get there? So ships are a very efficient way to move things around the world, and more than 80% of the goods that we use every day are at some point on a ship. The issue with shipping is that not only are there great distances to cover across the ocean, but the fuels that ships use are the dirtiest transportation fuel on the earth. On the right-hand side of the screen is heavy fuel oil. This is the fuel that powers over 80% of the fuel consumption that's used by the industry. And on the left-hand side is distillate fuel, similar to diesel fuel that you would put in a truck. That's what the smaller ships operate on. So the vast majority of ships are using this heavy fuel oil. And in fact, this fuel that's on the screen today has been heated up to 60 degrees Celsius just to get it to flow. At room temperature, it's a solid. So this fuel results in a lot of air pollution. And this is a map that we've generated, which we've taken the satellite data from the ship positions, so we actually see where the ships are going. And we use that information to figure out not only where the ships go, but also how much air pollution they're emitting. And so you can see that ships are emitting not just in the open ocean, but are also heavily concentrated near shore, impacting local air quality. So we're worried about shipping emissions not only from a climate point of view, but also from an air quality point of view. When we're talking about shipping, there's a lot of different types of ships, but there are three that really stand out. And the ships that end up emitting the most emissions of carbon dioxide and other types of air pollutants are container ships. There's about 70,000 commercial ships operating any given year, and only 5,000 of them are container ships, but they represent almost a quarter of the emissions going forward. So any solutions that we're going to be talking about in the future need to address emissions from container ships, bulk carriers that carry things like coal for the time being, but also iron ore and grain, and then oil tankers, which are carrying petroleum products primarily. We'll see if they still are around in the coming decades. And it's also important from a policy point of view to understand that shipping is very much like the Wild West. If you have a ship, you can pay to have it flagged in any country in the world. And those countries that are offering the least amount of red tape are those that end up getting the lion's share of the ships. So you'll see on this slide that Panama, Marshall Islands, Liberia, these are quite small countries on a global scale, but they end up representing a large portion of the ships that are actually sailing the waters of the oceans. What's worrying to us is that, as Alice was saying, what we really need to be doing is we need to have emissions follow this red trajectory. This is the minimum that we can do to achieve the Paris Agreement goals. And really, if we were to hit this red line, that's assuming that the shipping industry is going to maintain its fair share of emissions going forward. And so what we're worried about is that the business as usual trajectory, this blue line, is continuing to grow in a time where it really needs to start decreasing. And so the question that we're trying to tackle is, given that shipping emissions are outside of the Kyoto Protocol, they're outside of the Paris Agreement, how do we regulate international shipping emissions? Well, we tried to do it under the Paris Agreement. These are my friends and colleagues from an advocacy group called Transport and Environment. They actually went to Paris with these homemade elephant masks and donned them. And they demanded that international shipping and aviation emissions be included under the Paris Agreement. These were the two big elephants in the room that really needed to be addressed going forward. The UNFCCC said thanks, but the Kyoto Protocol has been clear. The International Civil Aviation Organization and the International Maritime Organization are the UN bodies that are responsible for regulating shipping and aviation, and so they need to start developing their own rules. So a short 21 years later, after the Kyoto Protocol insisted that IMO and ICAO take action, IMO has taken action to try and tackle its emissions from the sector. So just a couple of months ago, an agreement on IMO's initial greenhouse gas strategy. It was agreed to on Friday the 13th, which I think is a little ironic, but we're hoping that it's not really unlucky. They've agreed to reduce their emissions by at least half from their 2008 levels. 2008 is the peak year for emissions, as far as we know, as far as we've been tracking shipping emissions. And then shortly thereafter, we had the global economic downturn. That's why you see that volatility past 2008, just at the top of that red arrow. And now we're on this emissions trajectory back up. As Alice was saying, there's a close relationship between GDP and emissions. And as GDP and as we recover globally, that is going to be driving emissions in shipping. And we really need to be following these alternative paths towards zero emissions. So ambition is nice, but how do we actually reduce emissions from this sector? And Alice alluded to this before. She called it slow steaming. And what it means is that you take a ship that's currently traveling at one speed and you slow it down. There's an exponential relationship between fuel consumption and speed. So if you slow the ship down a little bit, you slow the fuel consumption down even more and the emissions associated with it. We also need to make new ships more efficient. The reason why we're focused first on the existing ships is because ships can last for 20 to 30 years. And so if we've only focused on trying to make the new ships more efficient, we wouldn't really get anywhere in a time that's meaningful for climate change. Not only that, we need to completely change how we fuel these ships. No more heavy fuel oil going forward. The time for that is limited. In the future, we need advanced biofuels, we need hydrogen power, we need fuel cells, and we need to think about how we actually get from a ship that's wholly reliant on fossil fuels and burning the dirtiest transportation fuel to one that's truly zero emissions. In the time being, we can retrofit ships with wind assist technologies. Some ships are using kites and sails, but only a handful. And then my favorite are the Flettner rotors, which are those tall columns. They actually spin, and using the Magnus effect, they draw the ship forward, which I think is pretty cool. And lastly, zero-emission vessels. So on the left-hand side of the screen are some zero-emission ships that currently exist today. We have hydrogen-powered ferries operating in Belgium, and we have a zero-emission, completely battery-powered bulk carrier operating in China, which ironically is transporting coal 40 miles to a coal-fired power plant. But we do have those ships, and we're working on building the ships on the right, which are the larger ships, the ferries and the container ships, that are the ones that are transporting people in cars, which car transportation across the ocean is actually a big source of emissions, and also the containers, which carry almost everything that we use. So I'll leave you with a couple of next steps. What we're focused on at the ICCT right now are developing the international, national, and subnational policies that are actually going to help achieve the goals that the IMO has set for itself in its initial greenhouse gas strategy. It's called an initial strategy because 5 years later, in 2023, we'll be agreeing to a revised strategy. But that doesn't mean that there's nothing going on in between. In fact, there's a big push to make short-term actions and short-term measures that immediately and meaningfully reduce emissions from the sector. The first being slow steaming, slowing those ships down. And the next is trying to develop these alternative low-carbon and zero-carbon fuels and propulsion technologies. And there's actually some work ongoing now to figure out how exactly we pay for these new technologies. So I will leave you with that, and thank you very much, and I look forward to our panel discussion coming up.